The Songwriter, Chapter 11, Restricted Support. I arrived in London and felt like I'd never left. So many people passing by with a lonely look on their faces, locked up in a city that claimed their very life, that clams in a shell. Everyone is alone, just like the corner of time, standing there waiting for another day to come. When it comes, everything might change. London is a place where people chase after the day before tomorrow, and when tomorrow comes, nothing ever changes. Like me chasing after dreams and banking on possibilities with my songs. I believed in what I was doing, and that gave me a purpose in life. I took the tube to the Oval and I made my way to the park at Kennington, where I would probably see Pat. Normally he's there every day. The benches in Kennington Park were comfortable as far as I could remember. I had lived there for a while before I found shelter at Pat's flat in Hotspur Street. It was still early in the day when I walked through the Green Iron Gate to the enclosure of Kennington Park. I wandered around for a while, hoping to catch a glimpse of Pat or one of the crew that I knew. It was a nice place to be, with the silence away from the noise of the traffic on the street. A man came over to me and said, "Hello there, it's a wonderful day." Not many had ever approached me like that before, and I looked at him and had a laugh because he spoke with a Belfast accent. And we started talking about things. I told him about being robbed and writing songs and sleeping rough. And he told me about being the youngest ever projectionist that ever got to show movies in Belfast at the Palace Cinemas, and how he and his wife came over to London for work. He told me that his name was Jim Thompson and that he had a son who was a surgeon in Guy's Hospital. We stood there and we talked for a long time until he looked at his watch and he said, Listen, I have to go now, but why don't you come in to my house on Saturday morning? My wife would love to meet you. I live at number 18 Brighton Road in Purley. We'll cook you some lunch and catch up with some of your stories." He seemed genuine enough, and he continued, "You know, my wife's in a wheelchair, and she hasn't spoke to anyone from Belfast in donkey's years. You would make her day." So I thought to myself, never look a gift horse in the mouth, and I replied, "Sure, I'll do that. Thanks for the invitation, Jim. I'll see you there Saturday afternoon around 3. I had to convince myself that I wasn't dreaming, and thought how kind of an offer was that. I watched him as he walked away, and that's when I saw Pat and a few of the boys sitting there on a bench in the sun. I made my way over to them, and when I was in shouting distance, I screamed over, "You look like the biggest band of expendables I've ever seen in my life." Pat and the crew, they all sat there for a minute or two on the park bench with the Brixton breeze in their face and the sun in their eyes. It looked as if they had already finished a bottle of vodka, at least one. This lady walking her German Shepherd passed by, and she was having a hard time keeping a hold of the choke chain as a short-haired Jack Russell began to chase after the big dog. The lads from Lambeth were having a bit of a laugh. She looked like a block of ice with nowhere to thaw until Pat got up and chased the Jack Russell away with a rolled-up newspaper that he plucked from a rubbish bin nearby. Sure, nobody likes yesterday's news," Pat said to the lady, who thanked him for helping. Then she fumbled in her purse and gave Pat a few pounds for his trouble. Pat came over to me and he said, "So, what was it you were saying about a band of expendables? Maybe you should say a band of dependables." We both had a good laugh. Good to see you, Pat. Is it okay to use your flat for a little while? Stay as long as you like, he replied. I sat with the lads and we listened to each other in the banter, and we spent some time just being there. That was the crowd that we sat with: Belfast Rab and Corkscrew Phil, Donegal Donny and Irish Ian and Dublin Jack, Pat and myself. And we laughed and we sat there without a care in the world, and when it was time to go home we all went our separate ways. Pat and I, well, we headed back to Hotspur Street. I told him about the meeting Jim there in the park and the invitation that I give for lunch on Saturday afternoon. So Pat included himself there on the invitation list. Saturday morning soon came around and we began the journey on foot down the Brixton Road to Purley. It took about 4 hours walking until we reached New Brighton Roads, and then we started to look at the house numbers. But we discovered soon that there was no number 18. Between the numbers 20 and 32 there was a nursing home, but there was no number 18. So I went inside the nursing home to make some inquiries about a Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, if they had them in their facility. The RN on duty explained to me that there was no one by that name living there. I thought that's weird. So I went into number 20 next door there and asked the person there who ran the English language school about number 18. And he knew of a Jim Thompson. The name sounded familiar. And then he told me a story which made the hairs of my head stand up and the blood in my veins run cold. Apparently, he said many years ago there was a number 18, but they knocked it down when they started building the nursing home. And then he went on, Mr. Thompson now, you say? Well, now, that name, it sounds familiar, but I can't be sure. I can tell you, though, that half of what we stand in here was number 18. It became an extension for a place here. Right where you are both standing, I can tell you now, half of that is, and was, number 18. I tell you what, maybe go down there to number 66. There's an old lady there who has lived there most of her life, and if anybody knows about a Mr. Thompson, it would be her. I stand here, wait till you get there and let her know I sent you, and I give her a wave to let you know, and her know it's okay, eh? So Pat and I, we walked up the number 66, and we knocked on the door. A very old lady answered the door, and I had told her then the story about Mr. Thompson and that the man from number 20 had sent us to see her. I pointed up in that direction of the street, and she had a look, and he gave her a wave and a nod, and she waved back at him, and then she invited us to come inside her home. Like a prisoner in a beautiful jail, she brought us inside to her parlour, furnished with antique clocks, oil paintings, chiffoniers and chandeliers, carved oak armchairs, and gold-framed mirrors, foot puffies on polished floors, expensive furs hanging on the doors, place for everything and everything in its place, just like her. A place to hide away from the whole world outside in her beautiful jail, waiting for her daily meal to come. She stood and she told us, sit down in the seat, I'll be back in a minute. And she left for a while. Pat and I, we just sat there and we listened to the tick-tock of the mantel clock upon the mantel, and then she returned with a heavily laden tray of sandwiches and tea and fruit and biscuits for Pat and me. I couldn't thank her enough. Pat and I were famished after the long walk from Lambeth. She never spoke. She just watched us as we ate everything on the tray. Her eyes were warm and welcoming, and she looked on with a sympathy. And then there the two of us were, like kings of the road after we had finished eating. I spoke to the old lady about Mr. Jim Thompson, but she avoided talking of him, and when I noticed that each time I would bring him into a conversation, she would quickly change the topic of the conversation. She seemed to direct the conversation more towards karma, and when I asked her about number 18, she would enter into the topic that instead spoke of the deeper spiritual aspects of life. We talked for a long time, and then the conversation just flowed. Then her 40-year-old daughter came into the room after knocking upon the door. She was very, very interesting indeed, with a bright, bubbly personality, and she wanted to listen to my stories about busking and my time on the streets. After the conversation was over, she gave Pat and I £10 each, and then a lift back to Lambeth in her fancy car. Pat and I were a little bit the wiser about Jim Thompson, not knowing anything, but we were much more the wealthier for the afternoon walk. To the very, very day that we're talking to you now, each time I think of Jim Thompson, I get goosebumps all over my body and shivers. Anyway, over the next couple of days, I spent the time with Pat and all the crew in the park, and found out a little bit more I did about this band of dependables. They all had one thing in common. They loved to drink, and they all worked labouring or laying bricks on building sites. And when they were working, they were not drinking, and when they were drinking, they were not working. So one thing came to another, and they earned a crust, and they got by and survived. It's funny what happens when you leave the land where you were born. All of the support networks that you once had are gone, and the family and friends easily forget you. In turn, you see new faces and you see new places that support you in a different way. And it binds you together with those from different and similar situations, just like the lads at Kennington who had supported each other through the hard times. Each one of the boys in the park had similar stories that found common ground where they all stood together as one. Belfast Rob was an artist who had lived alone all of his life in a small upstairs room near the docks of Belfast. He once had a horse and cart and collected some scrap metal from around the city. And on the back of the cart he had a variety of tools, a grinding stone and an anvil. And he also had a bell that he would ring so let the people know that he was on his way. The kids in the street loved to hear the sound of the bell, and they followed the horse around the streets of the district. Belfast Rob would go from street to street, sharpening up hedge clippers and knives, or repairing shoes, and any odd jobs that needed done or fixed. He made a living that way. His love of the drink had kept him company most of his life. After his horse died, he went over to London for a job on a building site, and Rob never returned to his hometown again. He fell into the company of the boys from the building sites, and they all ended up drinking in the park at Kennington. Corkscrew Phil, well, he was a cunning old fox from Cope Harbour in the Irish Republic, who was fed up with working on the farm, and he found work as a prison guard in Brixton Prison. And one of the inmates gave him the nickname of Corkscrew because he came from Cork and his work there as a prison guard, and the name stuck. After a while, those who got to know Pat called him by that name. Time passed, and Corkscrew was offered a better paid job as a labourer on a building site. He met up with an Irish crew there, and they all went drinking on a Friday night after work, and eventually the Friday evenings became every evening. Phil got a taste for the drink, and he liked it. He found a flat there near the Isle of Dogs, and he was happy enough there. After a few years he lost his job, and he moved into the back of a bus in a depot near Brixton. Then he met up with the other lads at Kennington, and on pension days, well, he would take himself over there to the park and he would drink with them. And now and then, Corkscrew Phil talked about the things that happened to him when he was a prison guard at Brixton. He told the story of when he was taken hostage by some of the inmates who made demands from the warden for a safe return. Corkscrew never returned to Ireland, and he found friendship with the boys there at Kennington. He retired from work, and after years of hard work there on different building sites around London, all the lads got to know and to like Corkscrew. Donegal Donny learnt the ropes early as life on the sea as a sailor. He was always at sea until his mother took ill, and then he returned to shore to look after her and care for her. And when she died, he was lost and never knew what to do. For all his life he had been on the boats. That was the only thing that he knew. The loss of his mother was a big blow to Danny. He took to the drink and nearly drowned, until he found his feet on the sea on a boat to England, where he was offered a steady job on a building site with a crew of Irish navvies, as he called them. They supported him for a while with digs there until he was able to look after himself. Danny met the boys at Kennington on different work sites, and their friendship grew. He said there was nothing in Ireland for him now, and Danny was there for good. He never returned to his home again, across the sea. Dublin Jack, well, he grew up in the hungry 30s, and he had a connection with the street gang in his first city that kept you young and fit to live with it, that times were hard and you had to be tough to survive. So Jack and his gang kept an eye on the east end of the city of Dublin and policed the business they conducted, importing a smuggled brand of brandy from France. After Jack and the gang were caught by the interference of the police, Jack did some time in prison. Jack's father had died shortly after Jack went to jail, and during the time, Father Sean, the local parish priest, supported Jack with prayers and visits in prison. Something happened inside the prison walls that changed Jack, and when he was released, Father Sean got him an honest job in London with a crew of Irish bricklayers. Jack started a new life and fell into the company of the boys of Kennington. He never returned to Dublin again, and at least once a week he would come over for a drink or two on the bench at Brixton, where he sat with the boys and the lads, having a few laughs and sharing a few stories. Irish Eamon was a musician who knocked around with Pat. They came to London with a pocket full of dreams and hopes and established themselves in the music scene there. Pat was the front man and had a strong and unique singing voice that propelled the band into a very promising career. Just before a contract was signed, there was an incident one night and a fight broke out on the street where Pat had his throat slashed, and the result of that was permanent damage to his vocal cords. And that was the end of the band and their career. And they all split up, except for Pat and Eamon, who remained friends. Over the years, they found the fondness of the drink and plenty of work to do in the building sites around London. Eventually, they met the boys from Kennington. Eamon met a girl and they were married and started a family. Every now and then he would arrive unannounced at Kennington Park and share a few drinks with the boys. Pat was from Bangor in Northern Ireland and was connected and knew Van Morrison. He also was connected to a heroin addiction. One night Pat broke into his brother-in-law's chemist shop looking for a fix of any kind. He had triggered the alarm, and when the police arrived there, Pat was in the corner trying to shoot up in his arm morphine from the needle of a kettle syringe. It was the last straw for the police, who knew and liked Pat. He had been given plenty of warnings before about his behaviour, but this time they told him they wanted him out of the country and he had until the next day to leave, and if they found him, he would end up in prison. That night Pat took the boat to England with Eamon, a close friend, and they had a dream to become famous, and the dream dissolved one night in a street fight that ended in Pat's vocal cords being slashed, and now and then Pat would go into the building sites around London when he had to. Most days, though, he was in Kennington Park with a bottle of Buckfast or Thunderbird or someone else's vodka. Although life had been unkind to Pat, Pat still had a kind heart underneath it all. After getting to know the boys, I decided I better go to the Australia House in London to see about getting my Australian passport back. And one morning, as I stood in the corner outside the front door of Australian High Commission at the Strand, I was checking that I still had the letter from the alderman in Australia that explained my situation since arriving in the UK in '88. I stepped inside the building with many memories of what I'd been through, and I approached the inquiries counter, where I spoke to the lady there with the long blonde hair and the beautiful tanned face. And for 10 minutes, without stopping to take a breath, I told her what had happened and then produced a letter from the Lord Mayor Marylands. She read the letter and handed me an application form for an Australian passport, and she said, "Have you read through this and answer questions in the form? You will need it to get your passport and maybe get your original certificate of naturalisation. There's other forms you might need to provide, so after we receive those, along with your completed form, then we'll start the period of processing your new passport." So I took everything she said, took it in deep into my skin, and I remembered, oh my God, the certificate of citizenship was one of the things that was in my suitcase when it was stolen. And I stared at her, and I said, "I'm an Australian citizen who's been left homeless here in the UK without any support for almost 2 years. The Australian authorities have been aware of my situation, and never once have I been supported by anyone from the Immigration or the High Commission. I would have expected the Australian government to bring me home, or even to find me safe in accommodation or an environment where I could wait until they were able to do that. Instead, what have I had? I've had to walk the streets alone without any support here. And I'm an Australian here. Not even the Department of Health and Social Security could help me. How do you think I feel? How would you feel if it was you? You should be ashamed to be representing the needs of Australians overseas. I have had no money, no food, no support, nowhere to live. And you're telling me I need this form to be completed to prove my Australian identity and provide a form for that?" And the lady just looked. She looked very nervous, and she said, I understand how you must feel, yeah, but we do have certain procedures to follow." I replied, "No, I don't think you understand at all. Today, when you finish work here, you're going to drive home in your car to your comfortable home where you can sit down in front of a 4-square meal, and you can have your glass of wine, and you can switch on your TV and enjoy the rest of your evening." Well, sir, you're not a person we would clarify as being in an emergency situation. Maybe if you tonight go down to the bull ring under the bridge at Waterloo, you just might start to understand what an emergency situation is. There are people there sleeping in cardboard boxes with little children, and some of them are Australian citizens. Well, with that, I walked out in disgust. I felt abandoned by the Australian government and resented the day I became an Australian citizen. So now I had a new set of circumstances to cope with. Somehow I had the need to get a new certificate of citizenship. That evening in Pat's flat, I wrote a letter to Bob Hawke, the Prime Minister of Australia. The following day I went to Lambeth Law Centre and told them of my story, and they tried to help me to get things sorted out. I was advised by the Australian High Commission to provide the date when I became naturalised, and they would do the rest to issue me with a new certificate of citizenship. So then we could then proceed with the application for an Australian passport. It was clear at this point that I was going to need a lot of time to get things sorted out and to get my passport, so I made the decision to go to Dublin for a little while and to busk my songs over there while I waited for all this paper shuffling to be done. I explained to Pat that I'd have to leave London again. He tried to convince me to stay, but I had to get away for a little while. Now, that process of getting my Australian passport had already begun. So I was in a position where it was just a matter of time for it to happen. And before I returned to Australia, I needed to say goodbye to my aunts in Wellingborough, my aunts in Belfast. And the first thing before I could do that was to go busking in Dublin. So I booked a flight and a travel agent in London, and I was leaving London behind. End of chapter 11.